In this second video on the Channel 4 documentary, Lucy Letby, Murder or Mistake, we're going to examine the contribution of lead prosecution witness Dr. Dewi Evans to that film. For those that don't know, Dr. Evans was the lead prosecution witness in the Lucy Letby case and is also primarily responsible for the medical evidence that appeared in court, having spent 5 years working on the case with the Cheshire Constabulary. It would be a conservative estimate to say that Dr. Evans is 95% of the prosecution case. So this is the first thing that Dr. Evans says in the Channel 4 documentary. If you're a doctor called to see a baby who's not very well at birth, not moving, not breathing, and within a few minutes of resuscitation you hear this very annoyed cry, it's brilliant. And eventually they go home, and when they return for a routine review, now being well developed, 2 big eyes, big smile, that's very, very satisfying. Most babies who receive care in a neonatal unit not only survive, but survive and become healthy adults. Now, that's all absolutely true, and I would say it's the most sincere thing that Dr. Evans says in the entire documentary. It could be said that the last sentence is kind of deliberately misleading and suggesting you could argue that it's trying to buttress the opinion they often made both during and since the trial that, most babies don't die in a neonatal unit, so therefore this is automatically suspicious. Nonetheless, overall this is a reasonable statement, and I want to be clear that I'm not questioning whether or not Dr. Evans was a good doctor. It's impossible for me to say whether that's the case or not, and I don't wish to comment on it. I can see absolutely that what he's saying here is absolutely true. It must be very rewarding when you see an infant that's struggling and you nurse them back to good health. I'm sure that's an incredible experience, and I'm sure he very sincerely wanted to do his best in Swansea, and I wouldn't wish to suggest otherwise. It's possible that he acted in good faith in the Lucy Letby case, but was just way out of his depth. I can't say for certain whether that's true one way or another. I don't consider him to be a bad person in terms of not caring about babies, just as that equally applies to the consultants. I do think there's quite strong evidence that he's arrogant, intransigent, intellectually lazy, avaricious, economical with the truth, shamelessly partisan, jingoistic and borderline prejudiced, while incapable of accepting any form of criticism or the possibility that he might be wrong. He's also, I think, quite clearly wreaked havoc in the court system, largely out of self-interest and an unshakable belief that he is always right, and he should have long since been removed from any credible body of expert witnesses, in my opinion. So then Dr. Evans goes on to say she's not innocent. The evidence was compelling, overwhelming, consistent. I'm astonished with what a current barrister is doing. I think it's been absolutely disgraceful. Now, I've spoken about this at some length in my previous video, and I mentioned that Evans doesn't define what he's done that is absolutely disgraceful or why it's absolutely disgraceful. It could be that such an obviously and deeply arrogant man can believe that simply disagreeing with him is disgraceful, but I have speculated in this other video that what he's referring to is Mark McDonnell making public comments, which is unbelievably hypocritical because he has been an incredibly prolific public commenter, giving numerous interviews, making numerous statements to newspapers. And he voluntarily did that from day one by doing an interview with Raj Persaud, and he's never slowed down since then. And he can't take one iota of criticism without having to have his say on it. So for him to say that the conduct of Mark McDonnell has been absolutely disgraceful is pretty hypocritical, in my opinion. So then Dr. Evans goes on to say, I'm Carmarthen born and bred. My parents had a dairy farm just 5 miles away from where I now live. If you look back at to the 1970s, the care of premature babies was very, very limited. So I set about developing a newborn service more or less from scratch. So I've got over 30 years of hands-on experience looking after sick babies. I heard about concerns regarding the death of babies in Chester by chance from a Sunday newspaper. So you could quibble about the 30 years of hands-on experience and say that it's very different dealing with these premature neonates. He was in the paediatric department of, I don't know if it's fair to say a minor hospital, but not I think a major hospital, and certainly not one where he was dealing with the sort of infants that are in the Lucy Letby case on a regular basis. However, what we can say definitively was that this comment that Dr. Evans has made here about I learned this by chance from a Sunday newspaper, in the BBC Panorama he claimed that he'd learned about it in a Guardian article. Now, he'd made this comment about a Sunday newspaper in previous interviews, but then in the BBC Panorama interview, he suddenly changed that to The Guardian. Now, I would suggest that what he did before the BBC Panorama is look up when it was first mentioned in the paper and then think, oh, I'll say that then. It's possible that his memory's playing tricks. Who knows? Because his stories change and he contradicts himself so many times, it's just impossible to say what the truth is. But this is the Guardian article in question. This was the first one on the 18th of May 2017 to report on the situation at the Council of Chester. So we'll assume for the sake of argument that he did read it in the Guardian newspaper and not in this Sunday newspaper that he's referenced in this Channel 4 documentary. It's very hard to say because he's again said two contradictory things. Another thing that I can clear up at this point is that in previous videos I was discussing whether or not he travelled to the police station in May. I happen to know that he definitely travelled for the first time in July because I've seen and been made aware of documents that confirm this. So I pretty much know the exact date when he first travelled to meet the Cheshire Constabulary, and it was definitely in July. So even though with that he has said he's given different versions in which he said May and which he said July, but I can now say that it was definitely July. So then he goes on to say, by that time I prepared dozens of reports for police authorities as an expert witness, and on this particular occasion I was exchanging emails about a completely unrelated case. I sort of answered and said, by the way, I've heard about this case where there are concerns regarding babies dying, and just added, it sounds like my kind of case. Then he goes on to show the files of Lucy Letby that he's got on a bookcase. There are a lot of question marks about whether he should be showing these off so readily and whether or not he's showing off confidential information. I think as well we can see Lucy Letby's name in some of these files, which also questions. He's claimed Lucy Letby wasn't named at any point. I wasn't aware of her name. Certainly based on the pictures that we saw, that doesn't necessarily stand up. But I don't want to go into that too much because there are medical people who are commenting on this, and I can't say definitively that Lucy Letby's name was definitely in those files because it passed by very quickly and it can't be confirmed for certain. What I can say is that this way he talks about it like, oh, I was just casually exchanging emails, and yeah, I was almost disinterested in this case when he was quite obviously begging to get involved in this case because the pound signs were flashing in front of his eyes. So the way that he's presented it is utterly ridiculous. I'd also like to note that it's important to point out that he calls them the Letby files. He doesn't say, here are the files on the situation at the Council of Chester. He calls them the Letby files. I found that to be quite significant. And, he tries to add weight by saying there's 20,000 pages, but the number of pages doesn't matter if you misinterpret everything. Then Dr. Evans says, when I first met Cheshire Police, they didn't know, nor did I, that they were investigating a crime at that time. So obviously I've covered this many times by now, but he's driving down to Cheshire Police Station. Why on earth would he be doing that unless they were investigating a potential crime? Now I suppose you could play semantics and say it's only a potential crime, not an actual crime, but obviously he must have known there was a very strong suspicion of there being a crime, otherwise it's not with the police. The police, as he goes on to say, they were just looking at a number of deaths from a neonatal unit. The police don't just randomly go around looking at deaths on neonatal units. There are deaths on neonatal units all the time, all over the country. The police don't just sit there going, oh look, there's a couple of deaths in Somerset, there's a couple of deaths in Bedfordshire. Of course they don't. They only do it if they think there's a crime or if there's a strong suspicion of a crime. So this idea that he went there, he's trying to claim that he went there with a completely open mind, and he's making, again, he always makes these claims, oh, I never heard the name Lucy Letby. I never suspected that there was a crime. I never heard of air embolism before. And he's not being, I'm be extremely surprised, of course, we don't hear from the director or the filmmaker, but I'd be extremely surprised if the filmmaker said to Dewi Evans, did you think there was a crime when you drove to the police station and then met with the police? Because naturally you would think there was a crime. It would be an inane, banal question to ask. But he always inserts these things. And he always inserts them before he's asked about them. So we've talked about the 7-hour round trip to Chester, to Blake and Chester, where he decided within at best 10 minutes, but now this 10-minute claim was shortened in Panorama to what seems like a few minutes, that there was definitely inflicted harm. So he went there with a completely open mind. It took him 3.5 hours to drive there, if he drove there in the fastest period possible according to AA Route Planner. Parked up his car, met with them, but then and all that time he had a completely open mind, but then he decided in 5 minutes, it's definitely inflicted harm. Then he drove back for 3.5 hours. I mean, I'm surprised his nose wasn't growing during the documentary, frankly. And then he sorry, I should also mention that I don't think I've put it on the screen here, but he made this remark in the documentary about, I asked for the cases for 2015 to 2016. So that is complete bullshit, because the Counts of Chester were already looking at a certain defined period. For him to claim that he himself defined the period is an obvious lie. It's just completely untrue. And yet, within a few minutes of documentary starting, he's already stating that when he first reviewed the cases and handed the suspicious events over to the police, he told them they must find out who was present on each of these shifts. Then he claimed that Letby was present at all the suspicious events they had identified. I mean, that's just completely untrue. We know that for a fact because Unheard has made it very clear from leaks that Lucy wasn't present at 10 of the 28 of those suspicious cases, which were filtered out of the final indictment. So that immediately raises serious selection bias issues, which is something that a lot of people can't seem to understand. Anyone with any intelligence, it's really obvious, but that there seems to be a bit of a blank among the idiot brigade regarding why this is significant. I mean, I really shouldn't have to explain it. I've explained it numerous times. I'm not going to explain it in this video because there's a lot of things to go over. But he's saying, we selected the cases and then Lucy was always on duty, whereas we know in 40% of cases that's not true. That's hugely significant because the prosecution case relies on that inference over and over again. Again, I've shown this in a previous video. I'm not going to go over it in this video because otherwise this video would go on for 4 hours. This would be the War and Peace of Dewi Evans, and no one wants to hear that story. I will just briefly mention, though, that when Dewi Evans was talking with John Sweeney, when John Sweeney really pushed him on this matter, he in fact conceded that he didn't view the cases blind, as was suggested by the documents that we saw in the documentary, despite the fact that he'd always insisted, I viewed the cases blind, I viewed the cases blind. There were no names on any of the cases. Well, actually there were. But never mind, that's just a lie that I've been telling up until now. So this was very clearly depicted in the documentary as well. So the next thing he says is, what I discovered was there were events where a baby would suddenly collapse, with most failing to respond to resuscitation. So all of this was very, very peculiar. Not just very peculiar, very, very peculiar. Because babies on neonatal units don't suddenly deteriorate and die. It just doesn't happen suddenly. So this is one of the central contentions of the case. One of the most important things to note is that all kind of subtle features have been missed. And the reason for this is because of the lack of skills on the unit, the lack of personnel on the unit, poor registrars, inexperienced nurses. They're not doing enough ward rounds. There's people going back and forth between the maternity unit. And this all collectively means that perhaps the signs, although there's still an enormous amount in the notes, so that isn't really an excuse for Dewi Evans, but what the unit believed was a sudden collapse in many cases. Although even then, I'm trying to be generous towards him, I suppose, but on the unit they may have believed that these were sudden collapses, but in fact they missed subtle signs. But then when you actually look at I've got stuff from a neonatal nurse, of course. I've got stuff from the panel. I've spoken to neonatologists now. I've spoken to paediatrics, vascular surgeons, other doctors. They all say that some of these collapses were not sudden. There were clear signs. They're not even subtle signs that were missed. Clear signs. So the way that the babies were characterised in court and the way that they collapsed was plain wrong. It's almost deliberately misleading. I can't do that justice in this video because, as I say, it would be enormously long. And we're going to discuss child D later in this video, but let's just briefly remind ourselves of child C. So in the case of child C, this infant was born at a very early premature gestational age. His intrauterine growth had been extremely poor. His birth weight was 800 grams. There had been reversed end diastolic abnormal blood flow. He was at high risk of intrauterine demise, stillbirth, and multiple immediate short-term and long-term complications. He shouldn't even have been delivered at a non-tertiary unit, so this is a level 2 unit. This should have been delivered at a failing level 2 unit, I should add. This infant should have been delivered at a level 3 unit, the highest level unit. We don't really know why he was delivered at this unit. So he was cold on admission. He had low white cells and platelet counts. He had severe intrauterine growth restriction. He developed respiratory distress syndrome. There were problems that were very evident from chest x-rays. He had multiple clinical signs of intermittent bowel obstruction, intermittent stomach and small bowel distension. There were dark bowel aspirates and vomiting. And this is why before I was connected with people that worked in paediatrics and neonatology, this is why a neonatal nurse told me, it's just a very clear bowel obstruction. As Colin Morley has said, as others have said, it's very obvious. And it's stated here, child C did not respond adequately to prolonged resuscitation because of inadequate resuscitation for 20 minutes following an acute episode of apnea, recovering respiratory distress syndrome and severe growth restriction with myocardial ischemia would have added further to the likelihood of a poor response to resuscitation. The apneic attack was likely precipitated by severe pain due to a further episode of acute small bowel obstruction, precipitated by feeding. The suggestion that the multiple signs of intestinal obstruction could be caused by injection of air through the nasogastric tube is untenable. As I've said previously, it's generous to say it's untenable. I would say ludicrous would be more accurate. Child C died because of a decision to discontinue respiratory support and resuscitative effort in the face of a poor response following inadequate resuscitation for at least 20 minutes after an acute episode of apnea. The clear prior signs of intermittent bowel obstruction that warranted urgent surgical opinion and investigation had gone unrecognised. So let's contrast that with what Dr. Evans said. A baby would suddenly collapse, with most failing to respond to resuscitation. So the indication always that he gave in court was there was no explanation for this. It was sudden. There were no signs. It just happened for no reason. Oh yeah, it's because Lucy Letby injected air into the stomach. Just absolute crap. So to move on to the next point, he then said, I identified a time and a date where there's somebody hurting these babies. This is not some sort of accident. This is not incompetence. Something deliberate has happened here. Intentional harm. What I said to the police was that they should look at the shift systems and find out who's on duty for all these collapses. So we've discussed the statistical aspect already. The first sentence is quite surreal, I would suggest, where he's saying this is not some sort of accident, this is not incompetence, as if this is, the only possible explanation. And then later on in the film, he claims that he did take mistakes into consideration. We're going to assess that claim later on. So how is it that all of these things were downplayed in court? Everything that I've just read out to you, that's just one infant. So when he was asked about not taking mistakes into consideration, not taking prior signs into consideration, he didn't say a single word about child C. He made one pathetic claim about child D. Now, if he had given a lot of context for these infants, he would have said a lot more. But here he's just saying, I could tell that it was definitely... It couldn't possibly have been an accident. It couldn't possibly be incompetent. It had to be deliberate. It's just a bizarre claim from him here. Before going over the statistics again, which we've already discussed, what he did, saying... In fact, previously he'd said a lot of collapses. Here he says all of these collapses. Previously, he told the Daily Mail, I believe, find out I was on duty for a lot of collapses. And as they moved him around all over the place... there's always going to be someone who was on duty for a lot of collapses. Indeed, the methodology used meant that if Lucy Letby wasn't identified, someone else would have been identified. Lucy Letby would have become a marginal character in this court case, and they would have tried to pin it on someone else. And if you think they wouldn't have tried to do that, remember what happened with Victorina Chua, because that was originally, I believe, was it Rebecca Layton, was originally the nurse. I think she was in prison for 6 weeks. and came out, and now Victorina Chu was in prison. So if you think they wouldn't try and pin it on someone else just because Brereton Jeran walked in there and basically named Lucy Letby, guess again. So as we've seen from the international panel now, there were a catalogue of egregious errors on this unit. I think quite a few of these errors were known about before this report was published, but of course they've brought new things to light and they've emphasised some of the existing problems that we knew about. So I could go through all 14, but I just want to look at number 2 briefly in this video, which is failure to consider the obstetric history. So we're going to be getting into this in more detail later this month, but I'm going to just have a look at the court case now. So if we go across to the complete trial here, so let's just look for the word obstetrics. As you'll see, it's Monday the 7th of October. You have Dr. Joanne Davies, consultant in obstetrics and gynecology for child D. And then on Wednesday the 30th of November, there's Dr. Simon Woods, consultant obstetrician and gynecologist. That's for child F. That's it. So this is a trial that went on for 10 months. It might have been active for, say, approximately 200 days to suggest a round number during that period. And the amount of time spent discussing obstetrics was approximately less than half a day. So you're looking at what? 0.25% of the trial? So when we go back to this assertion that there was a failure to consider the obstetric history, I think we can tick that one off as being correct quite easily. Certainly, it was absolutely never referenced in the trial, which indicates that it wasn't referenced in the so-called science that was put into the trial, which therefore means that this statement about failing to consider the obstetric history, which is absolutely critical, is absolutely reasonable. Of course, there were all of these problems as well with the hospital. So the fact that this is all completely omitted from the trial, and Dr. Evans, as we know, has given almost none of this. We might as well say he's given literally none of it. Now, he claims otherwise, but everything that I've seen indicates that he's never given any context, and he's just blamed baby claps for no reason. It was Lucy Letby's fault. That's basically what he said over and over and over again. And there's no other explanation other than the explanation that I've given. That was the third thing. So I don't think any claims that he makes in this film about taking into consideration mistakes, taking into consideration context, taking into consideration clinical signs are reasonable. And even then, we'll see later on, what he does say is extremely limited. So then Dr. Evans says, and in looking at all of these cases, all of these events occurred when these babies were in the care of one particular nurse, quite often in the sole care of one particular nurse. So we know that this is incorrect because this has been broken down by statisticians, and it's been made very clear, including by people that I've interviewed on this channel, that this is impossible. I should say that I've got some interviews with statisticians coming up over the next few weeks, so I'm sure you'll find those very interesting. The second thing is, as mentioned previously, Lucy Letby's name is all over the documents. We know that for a fact. And the third thing is, as I've discussed in previous videos, Dr. Evans files numerous reports after he definitely knows Lucy Letby has been arrested. So obviously we know this is the case for child C, but I'm going to go through some of these now. So here's Dr. Evans' report from 2019. Lucy Letby's arrested July 2018. So he definitely knows the name Lucy Letby at that point. Absolutely no doubt. So here, child N, he authored his report in 2019. And then this is child P report from 2019. But then the reports continue. So there's references here from reports from 2017 to 2019. Then there's a report from 2021. This is for child G. Then there's a report, this was one of the reports for child C that's made in September 2022. Then we learned that Professor Kinsey, I'm certainly not as critical of Professor Kinsey, but she filed a report in November 2022. Then we hear another reference here to a report in September the 14th, 2022, not for child C, but for child G. This is after the court case has commenced. So there are various points, reports that are filed after the point where Dr. Evans definitely knows that Lucy Letby is the defendant even. So, I mean, sometimes he's literally staring at her in the courtroom. I was gonna say he's been arrested, but at some points he literally knows she's the defendant. But for all of these reports, they're all being filed after Lucy Letby has been arrested, and Dr. Evans is amending his opinion, putting new aspects into the case. This is for multiple reports across multiple infants. And then on top of that, these are just the reports that I know about. I would like to be able to have a full list of every single report that he filed with the police and every single date, so that I could be as authoritative and as exhaustive as possible. Unfortunately, I don't have access to that information. I have to piece it together from the kind of inadequate social systems that most of which have been put together by people who weren't paid. That complete trial has been put together by Jabe, who wasn't paid to do that. That's because, as I say, of the inadequate social systems that exist in this country that pass for infrastructure. And clearly, in relation to the criminal justice system, they are deeply inadequate. So, I mean, could it really be any worse? Could the situation sincerely be worse than someone who's just changing the reports around to make it fit this picture of Lucy Letby being on duty after it's been established that she's the suspect, and he's even doing this in court, and then he's even doing it after court? I mean, it could hardly be worse if it was a literal kangaroo court in a banana republic. I must say as well, I stopped looking at 2023 because I kind of hoped that they would have stopped writing reports at this stage. But of course, Dr. Evans still submitted reports after that date, after the court case was concluded, as referenced in The Guardian. Then he denied that he'd changed his mind. Then he admitted in Panorama that he had changed his mind, and he said that it doesn't matter. And then in this Channel 4 documentary, he then claimed again that he hadn't changed his mind once more. But we're going to assess that in a section later on. In the meantime, you can see on the screen now that this is, I'll read the whole thing out. So this is, Dr. Evans has now made this extraordinary new letter that he's sent to numerous newspapers. Daily Telegraph's already reported on it. And in this letter, he said, the police need to straighten up the details regarding child C. And he's now made the claim that, I always knew it was on the 13th, but the police got the dates mixed up and I noticed this in court. He never said this previously. He's always previously he said, I never changed anything. Now he's saying, then he'll go on Panorama and say, I did change things, but it doesn't matter. Now he's saying, I only changed things because I realised the police had cocked it up. Like, it's beyond a joke. It's absolutely beyond a joke. I mean, he really, for his own good, he should shut his face at this point. It's extraordinary what he's doing. Absolutely extraordinary. But anyway, Mark MacDonald has said, absolutely correctly, justice demands that this report is released. The main prosecution expert is calling on the prosecution to set the record straight, and they are not doing so it's time for the Secretary of State to intervene. The prosecution claims that there is nothing in the report that will make the original verdict unsafe, but we have no way of knowing whether this is true. The evidence of their chief expert is now in doubt. The Crown Prosecution Service said it would not be appropriate to comment on specific aspects of the case while the CCRC were assessing the convictions. A spokesman said Lucy Letby was... Yes, they just say the same thing every time, so I'm not going to read that out. Obviously, Cheshire Police declined to comment, as they always do. So, this is an extraordinary situation that's emerged just literally in the time when I've been recording this video. And we can see how much we can trust the institutions of this country. The Crown Prosecution Service are just battening down the hatches. The Cheshire Constabulary have already battened down the hatches ages ago. And it's just a very sorry tale for anyone that believes that this country is, in any way credible in terms of its infrastructure, and that the processes that take place within that infrastructure are in any way transparent. I mean, I don't see how you could possibly believe that at this stage, but it just becomes clearer and clearer that, really as a society, we're in massive decline. But anyway, that's not the subject of this video. I just feel that I need to say that. So this is already calamitous for Dr. Evans, the prosecution case, and the safety of this conviction. But let's continue, because I know we've got a hell of a lot more to come. So the next thing he says is, I've been involved in court cases for over 30 years, and where my report was supportive of the prosecution, I've not lost a case. So on the whole, I think my trial practice is very satisfactory. People seem to have forgotten that the victims are the babies, the victims are the families. So this barely needs any response. It's the usual line that he trots out about he's never lost a case. So this just indicates how tone deaf and oblivious he is, considering how much he's been criticised for saying this previously. Then on top of that, he trots out his line about people forgetting the victims of the babies. So a very transparent and insidious appeal to emotion, not least because, as usual, it's total rubbish. Literally no one has forgotten about the babies. I haven't encountered a single person who is anything other than regretful about the baby suffering and or sadly passing away. This is just a pathetic deflection technique. Everyone recognises that the families have suffered. Everyone recognises that dead babies is a regrettable thing. That's nothing to do with whether or not you've been involved in court cases previously or whether or not this is a safe conviction. That's just an attempt to emotionally manipulate. Then there are a few things to say about this assertion about trial practice. So firstly, obviously you, Dr. Evans, think that your trial practice is satisfactory. You're not objective. Two judges already disagree, and frankly, Judge Goss just bottled it when it came to throwing you out the case. He should objectively have thrown you out the case. Secondly, your trial practice obviously isn't satisfactory because you're not supposed to win all the cases. You're supposed to give impartial expert testimony. Thirdly, this isn't about your trial practice, it's about you putting nonsense science in the court case in the first place. I mean, I must say that your trial practice was really poor in this case because your cross-examination was an absolute train wreck. But anyway, when no one's saying the problem is with your trial practice, everyone is saying that the reports that you produced and the so-called clinical explanations that you came up with are rubbish. I will say that it's the last refuge of the scoundrel to rely on appeals to emotion. No one that has legitimate arguments does this. It's always a technique of people that seek to manipulate. So then Dr. Philip Hammond makes his first appearance, or at least the first appearance in this video. And I should mention briefly that he's been writing for Private Eye. And he says, since the trial, I can't find another neonatal expert who's prepared to back up his ideas. Find me one. I've sent this to Dewi Evans. You must know people who are prepared to back you up. He said, I'm out of touch with everyone now. I can't find anyone. And Philip Hammond describes that as extraordinary. So I should mention as well, just in addition to this, and of course no one has come up since this was filmed. There has been no one to support him. I would be incredibly surprised if anyone came forward now. This would be like, an act of almost biblical significance if anyone came forward now. It's just not going to happen. And I should mention as well that Philip Hammond has, he's begged. He's put several, I think, at least one. But I think it's several. He's asked several times for people to come forward, and no one has, because no one wanted to back these theories up because they're not credible. It's as simple as that. That's why no credible person wants to be associated with them. And I'm damn sure after this performance and the letter he's written, we're not going to see anyone coming out of the woodwork now. So then Dr. Evans said, I think the inquiry is looking at all the events leading up to the deaths of these babies. It's not looking at whether Lucy Letby is guilty or not. That's been agreed in the court, so there's no question about her guilt. Yeah, absolutely. This barely needs any response. Firstly, yes, that's what the inquiry is looking at. There's no need for you to think. That's just a ridiculous statement. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? What the Thirlwall inquiry is looking at? Yes, the Thirlwall inquiry is only looking at the events leading up to the deaths of their babies. That's of no relevance to anything to do with you whatsoever. I suppose that something we might add at this point is, why didn't the inquiry ask for the primary witness in the court case to make an appearance? I'm sure you would have given a sparkling account of yourself. Secondly, the wording here is absolutely bizarre. So he talks about guilt having been agreed in court. There's no questioning of Lucy's guilt, except all of the massive problems that you've introduced into the courtroom. We know that the court found her guilty. You can't say someone was found guilty in court, so there's automatically no question about her guilt. There is an appeal system. Every civilized country has an appeal system. Britain is not alone in that. So just to say that being agreed in court, he says, being agreed in court, as if it's like, some sort of deal to buy equipment from a DIY store. Obviously there's a trial process. It's not agreed in court. There's a decision made based on the court process. But to say that there's no question about Lucy Letby's guilt is frankly a ridiculous assertion. The court process is just people walking into a room and saying stuff. In your case, Dr. Evans, you're willing to say almost anything, seemingly. But, this obviously was a very specious remark. But next, we have an absolute zinger. What is astonishing is the noise from people who feel that they can make outrageous comments through scientific papers such as Private Eye. So it's a great comment, of course. Just two things to point out. It's not a paper and it's not scientific. Private Eye is a periodical satirical magazine. It's a bi-weekly satirical magazine. It's not a paper, because papers come out every day or at least once a week. It's not scientific. It's all about political satire. If Dr. Philip Hammond didn't write for it, there would be no science in there at all. This would be well known anyway, but Ian Heslop, the editor of Private Eye, has been on Have I Got News For You on BBC Two initially, now I believe it's on BBC One, 621 times, according to IMDb. And he's probably been on the BBC over 1,000 times. I'm sure he's been on the BBC over 1,000 times. As for this outrageous comments, as you haven't cited any specific comments that are outrageous, I don't know what you're referring to, but Dr. Philip Hammond was pretty highly regarded before he wrote for Private Eye. He's written now 29 columns on this case, and these columns are very highly regarded. He's got in touch with neonatologists, he's got in touch with other scientists. These are quite forensic investigations, and we're fortunate there is a publication such as Private Eye that will give him the opportunity to do it. We're also fortunate that the Daily Telegraph have strongly backed this campaign and the Guardian have strongly backed this campaign, because now all the other newspapers are having to come in line. Just today, the Spectator for the first time has published something very favourable, and the reason they've done that is they know they have to amend their position because there is no one credible left. There isn't a single serious or credible person, let alone credentialed or qualified, who believes this is a safe conviction. That's why even publications that have been hostile to the line taken by Private Eye, taken by the Daily Telegraph, taken by the Guardian, taken by the New Yorker initially, that's why even publications that have been hostile to that are softening their stance, knowing that this is a very unsafe conviction. So then we move on to another particularly insightful remark from Dr. Evans. The most hysterical support for Lucy Letby has come from the great Metropolitan elite, or what I call them, God's most entitled. In Wales, we've been told for the past 700 years that we're not good enough. So I think this is... I shouldn't break this down too much, but obviously I do need to go into this a little bit. To anyone that has a brain, this is obviously a ridiculous statement. And I think using the word hysterical is in itself hysterical. There hasn't been any such hysteria. People have been rightly critical of this court case because of what I've just described, the fact that now there is no serious, credible, credentialed, qualified person who believes that this is anything other than a very unsafe conviction. That's not hysteria. That's just people looking at it rationally and deciding this guy, Dr. Evans, has put a load of crap in the court case. That's not hysteria. That's just an accurate assessment of what you've done. What Dr. Evans describes as the great metropolitan elite, that group, if it even exists, frankly it sounds more like a conspiracy theory than anything with credibility, is the least likely to be hysterical. Secondly, I've pointed out in my previous video that this is inaccurate. I mean, every assessment he makes about the kind of demographic constitution of the critics of the case and the panel and people who are criticising him is completely inaccurate. And then thirdly, Dr. Evans seems to have this bizarre chip on his shoulder that everyone looks down at Wales, particularly the so-called great metropolitan elite, whatever that is. So firstly, I see no reason to believe this whatsoever. I've never met anyone in my entire life who's prejudiced towards Wales. In fact, I'd say at the moment Wales is quite fashionable because of that TV show with James Corden in it that I've never watched. His name escapes me. But that is actually made... Is it filmed in Portmeirion or somewhere around there? I don't know. I could be completely wrong because I never watched TV. I didn't used to watch TV before I started doing this, but I mean, I have no spare time to do anything now. So, I would say my impression is that Wales has become quite fashionable. I know recently there's been a newsreader on 5 Live who's started working, who has an incredibly strong Welsh accent. I don't think anyone looks down at Wales. I think it's complete rubbish. Everyone that I know has nothing but good things to say about it and what an attractive country is and how nice and down-to-earth the people are. I think it's total rubbish to say that people look down at Wales. And I must as well recount my experience with doctors and professors, which has been unreservedly positive. Now, I come from a very humble background. I went to a comprehensive school in a far from salubrious part of the country. Let's be honest, it was rough as shit when I was growing up in the 1980s. And I don't have any kind of, private school, or I didn't go to the right university or have the right school tie or anything like that. I've spoken to many doctors, many professors, many credentialed people now. You've seen me interview some of them on this channel. My experience with them has been universally positive. Everyone, I mean, frankly, I've received too much respect. I mean, people have said so many nice things to me and about me, and they've been nothing but encouraging, nothing but helpful. All they want to do is assist you, and if they see someone who's doing something good, then they'll credit it. The idea that they're stuck up and snobbish and look down on people, that's just simply not my experience, not certainly with people that are interested in this case. All they really care about is three things, I would say. First thing is their specialism, and that their specialism is represented adequately and accurately. Secondly, they care about truth, generally, broadly speaking. And thirdly, they care about justice. They don't care about if you come from where I come from, which I won't mention, but pretty shitty part of the country, to be honest. Or if you come from Wales, or wherever you come from. It doesn't make any difference to them. They just care about the truth. So this is just a ridiculous remark that, in my experience, is completely unfounded, let alone is it a broad trend. And then I'll also say, so David Davis grew up on a council estate. I've not experienced any prejudice or belittling attitudes from anyone. All I've experienced is people who are passionate about justice, their particular expertise, who want to share knowledge and understanding. It's the absolute inverse of elitism. I'll give you an example. There's someone I haven't had on the channel yet, but I've recorded the interview. This person gave me 90 minutes of their time very graciously, despite the fact they're very, very busy, very prominent. And then at the end of the interview, they told me that they're running a class for PhD students in their home and that they were going back to see how they were getting on with a task that they'd been set. That's the kind of person that you're dealing with. Not elitist people that are passionate about learning, knowledge, understanding and getting things right. None of which seems to apply to you, Dr. Evans, I might say. And it's just, speaking of getting things right, Dr. Evans has written this rabid letter that I've referenced already because he's crying about making himself look like an idiot in this film. So what does he say in this letter? So I tweeted out about this yesterday. He said that Professor Hindmarsh stated that baby F and baby M were both poisoned with insulin. So he got the wrong baby because it was child L that was poisoned with insulin. So we'll see him later on ranting on about getting his facts right, but he can't even get basic facts about the case correct, which is deeply ironic. So next, referencing child O, Dr. Evans says, I saw pictures of the autopsy. There were incredible abnormalities in the liver. The pathology opinion was that the liver abnormalities were so severe that they looked like what you get in a road traffic accident. So the first thing to note is that he saw pictures of the autopsy. He wasn't in attendance at the autopsy, of course, because he hasn't examined any of the children, but he has been able to overturn all of the pathology and coroner reports. Secondly, Manarides has been strongly criticised for this, and rightly so. This is what was stated by a paediatric pathologist with 25 years of experience on BBC File on 4. I am a paediatric pathologist, a perinatal pathologist. I have 25 plus years of experience. We deal with 500 deaths a year in my institution and many neonatal deaths, so I think that I have quite robust expertise. I'm not saying that she's innocent or she's guilty. What I'm saying is that the way that the pathology was presented is not convincing to me. The court heard that x-rays showed a higher than normal amount of gas in his body. The prosecution said Letby murdered him by injecting air into his stomach and into his veins and by inflicting a severe liver injury. After baby O died, there was a post-mortem done by a very experienced pathologist, Dr. George Cockeye. He found baby O had 2 hematomas, 2 spots of internal bleeding in his liver. These are usually caused by injury or surgery, but there are other ways they can be caused. Dr. Cockeye said they could have been caused by the venous catheter, the tube into the baby's vein through the umbilical stump, which could have damaged the wall of the liver. Or he said these hematomas could have been caused by a lack of oxygen. This is rare, but it happens. I've seen it a few times in my career, and we know this baby suffered from a lack of oxygen before he died. So either a lack of oxygen or trauma from the umbilical catheter could have caused the internal bleeding. The expert for the prosecution said this was not possible, but I agree with the original report. The prosecution's expert pathologist, Dr. Manarides, disagreed with Dr. Cockeye's original report on what called the liver bleed. He said he'd only seen this type of injury in a road traffic collision or in cases of child abuse. Unless a witness saw non-accidental injury occur, then you can't say this. So to say that it is beyond reasonable doubt and that this was not something natural, that this is a non-accidental injury, to put it bluntly, it's naive. It depends on the opinion and experience you have. I have seen it, but the prosecution expert must never have seen it. So firstly, it's important to emphasise this isn't a difference of opinion. There are multiple experts that are against the prosecution case, including the original pathologist and coroner. In addition to that, Marnarides is leaning on the opinion of Evans, whereas the original pathologist didn't see this. Evans has completely fabricated Lucy Letby using a tool to attack Chaldo. That's just literally a figment of his imagination. There is no evidence for that whatsoever. The pathologist didn't cite this, the coroner didn't cite this, the hospital didn't cite this, no one on the ward saw or suspected this. It was only when Dr. Evans started making things up that it suddenly appeared. Then, on top of that, let's not forget that Dr. Evans concluded that the infant died due to air being injected into the stomach, which is beyond farcical considering the clinical picture of the infant. So let's move on to the next thing he said. Well, let's have a look at it. If you've got the evidence, publish it. Send me a copy. Let's see where we get to. Yeah, he's a barrister. So why would anyone need to send you a copy? You are not the arbiter of anything. You're a retired paediatrician who should have been thrown out of the court case by Lord Justice Jackson. After Lord Justice Jackson said that your opinion is worthless, you should have been thrown out by Goss. Immediately. You shouldn't even be on the NCA list due to having not worked in a hospital for 20 years. Not to mention the fact there's been other cases where people have said that you gave biased opinions. And then, with respect, you're nearly 80. You're clearly nothing particularly special to begin with. No one needs you to review reports authored by 26 world-class experts, with even one of those experts massively outranking you. That's even assuming that you acted completely in good faith in this trial, which is looking increasingly shaky. Then, on top of that, the police won't release your reports that you authored after the trial, which differ from the opinion you gave during the trial, which was changed from the opinion that you went into the trial with the intention of delivering. Also, I want to mention that Mark MacDonald is working pro bono. You were definitely not pro bono, so if you're trying to suggest that Mark MacDonald is not objective with this barrister remark at the end, then that's pretty poorly founded, because we reckon you maybe took $500,000 out of this case. You certainly took several $100,000. He's taken nothing. So if you're saying he's just saying anything to defend his client, as if he has a vested interest, you have a much bigger vested interest. So next, Dr. Evans says, none of that argument regarding miscarriage of justice applies in any of these cases. These were stable babies. They were vulnerable babies because of their prematurity, but their prospects of survival was excellent. So we've been over this many times, so I'm not going to go into this in great depth yet again. All I will simply say is that if you look at the babies which died in this case, they were undoubtedly a lot more vulnerable than Evans is suggesting, and not well at the time of their collapse. Furthermore, Lucy Letby is actually facing more life sentences for attempted murder than murder. Anyone knows that a neonate and a premature baby can collapse suddenly, particularly if it's low birth weight with other medical issues. So most of the sentences against Lucy Letby are related to these collapses where Dr. Evans just said, oh, the baby collapsed for no reason. So that makes it even more farcical. That what he's saying here, oh, these were all completely stable babies. They couldn't possibly have been expected to collapse even once. Total rubbish. And then he goes on to say, these are some medical remarks made by Dr. Evans here. This is the kind of chart that was used in Chester to monitor a baby's well-being. This one is for illustrative purposes only to avoid any difficulties with confidentiality. It shows a heart rate which is nice and normal. All of these are indications of a baby being well, but despite all of this, what happened here? Well, Lucy Letby arrived. The little baby was assaulted and he died as a consequence. The babies that collapsed all had records similar to this. Letby appears and suddenly one has a baby who's at death's door. So this is so spectacularly biased and so spectacularly inappropriate. I don't really know where to begin in terms of responding to it. In fact, I don't feel I should respond to it in depth because anyone that's looking at this even remotely objectively will see that this is an absolutely ridiculous account of what occurred. There's just it actually beggars belief that he's gone on to Channel 4 and said this. I mean, it's utter quackery. People with more medical qualifications than me, which is not particularly difficult, have already responded to the heart rate issue in depth. The rest of it doesn't merit any response at all. Oh, look, Lucy Letby's arrived. You know, what absolute embarrassing crap. He says, like, the little baby was assaulted as if that's a fact. And that, you know, Letby appears and then the baby's at death's door. It's absolute rubbish. And then the worst thing about this of all is he's always going on about, oh, I never saw the name Lucy Letby. This was a dispassionate medical assessment. But then he says this kind of stuff where he was clearly obsessed with Lucy Letby. And, you know, all these things he said, oh, it's nothing to do with statistics. It's all just about, oh, you know, Lucy Letby came and then the baby died. Absolute rubbish. We're just in an absolute embarrassing statement. And then he's going on here to talk about statistics. So statistics did not play a part in Letby's conviction. The worst statistician said, well, what about the babies who died who are not on the spreadsheet? And of course my answer was, well, their deaths were not suspicious. There was an explanation for the deaths. You're correct. There was an explanation for the deaths. There was also an explanation for the deaths that you consider to be unexplained. They were explained by the pathologist and the coroner. Yes, some of them had an undetermined cause, but that's not particularly unusual, especially for premature neonates. There was nothing suspicious about them until you came along. When you say there was an explanation for these deaths, but not for these other deaths, you simply mean, according to you. It's your explanations. Those explanations, in your opinion, doesn't carry much weight at this point. So I just want to mention as well, this is Stephen, who's tried by stats, speaking in the documentary. So he speaks here about Child C. We've already spoken about Child C in this video, but we're going to talk about it a little bit more now. So Stephen says basically what happened is they identified the attack that took place on baby C as taking place on the 12th of June. All the experts, like Dr. Evans, agreed that this attack took place on the 12th of June. They developed a theory, and the theory revolved around an X-ray taken on the 12th of June, and they said it had too much air, and the explanation was that it was an injection of air. During the trial, they realised Letby wasn't there, and they're now saying the attack happened on the 13th. But they're still trying to take the evidence from the 12th. But what is evidence is sworn witness testimony saying she wasn't there. And then Peter Elston says to him, yes. And at what point did the prosecution counsel realise that there was this mistake, do you think? So the prosecution circulated a draft of their opening speech to the media before they gave it. So in their draft, they said the radiologist identified this on the 12th, but when they talked to the juries, when they actually gave the speech in the transcript, there's no mention of the day. So they kept what the radiologist said and just removed the day because the day was wrong. It's quite brazen. Well, you've uncovered something quite remarkable here. So we all know about this now. And then there's a comment from file number 4 that Lucy Letby wasn't working on the 12th of June when the x-ray was taken. Then we have Philip Hammond talking about this, saying it's a really good documentary. It transpired that Lucy Letby wasn't on duty, and it's possibly one of the reasons that the lead prosecution witness, an expert, Dr. Dewi Evans, appears to have changed his mind. And then he goes on to say, this is Philip Hammond speaking still. In my email exchange with him, he says he now believes that the babies were only destabilised by having been ejected into the stomach and weren't killed. Sorry, that should be injected into the stomach and weren't killed. Now, to me, that's really serious because that means the jury was misdirected. They were told this was the cause of death and it was something else. The thing I find extraordinary is that Dewi Evans is now saying he's only just finished the final report well over a year after the trial ended. So that suggests he still hasn't quite got to grips with the case and there may be significant doubts as to how babies died. So then we hear Mark MacDonald talking about this and he says, Dr. Dewi Evans says he's drafted a new report. So out there is a new report from an expert who's changed his mind on a murder case. I have never known anything like this to happen. They thought she was there. They made a mistake. She wasn't there. So the answer to your question, so he's talking here on the phone, so I'll skip that bit. He just says, remarkably, Dr. Evans has now changed his mind on the cause of death of baby C. Dr. Evans has also said that he has a new report. Despite numerous requests, the prosecution have yet to give this report to the defence, and they're still not giving the report to the defence now, as we've learned from this letter. So there now is the very serious prospect that Parliament could get involved, because you can't have a situation where you've got witnesses speaking out this way, witnesses sending statements to the media, witnesses calling on the police and prosecution to reveal information, and that information is being withheld. So for the first time, there's a very serious chance of political intervention at this point. So I'll just read what is written in this letter. Given the time constraints, it was inevitable that the documentary concentrate on just a couple of cases. The timing of baby C's collapse created confusion. In my very first report, I raised concerns regarding the event late on Saturday 13th of June 2015 that led to his collapse and death. Over the next 5 years, the dates seem to have become confused, leading to the prosecution alleging that the assault took place the previous day. I recognise the confusion at the trial, reaffirming my original concern that the fatal assault was late on the 13th of June. I believe that Cheshire Police, the CPS and the prosecution team should set the records straight. Back in 2017, when I first raised concerns regarding baby C's demise, I was unaware of Letby's presence on the unit, let alone that she was up close to baby C at the time of his collapse. There is nothing in baby C's clinical records to confirm Lucy Letby's presence. So let me just make a few comments here. So the first thing is, he's never mentioned this previously. So he didn't give any such explanation, even remotely like this in court. We've got the court transcripts. I've been over these previously. I'm not going to go over them in this particular video because otherwise it's going to go on for about 3 hours. We know for a fact that he didn't say this in court. We know for a fact he's been asked about this several times previously. He's never said this previously. Now he's calling on the police, the Crown Prosecution Service and the prosecution to set the records straight. He's also claiming, I had no idea it was Lucy Letby, but as I've just said to you, he's staring at Lucy Letby in the courtroom at this point. So this is truly extraordinary. He should not be saying this. Not only is this all kinds of problems for the court now, all kinds of problems for the police and prosecution, but also in addition to that, could he be a less reliable witness at this point? Is there any conceivable way Dr. Evans could be, unless he just came out and said, yeah, I deliberately lied all the way through the trial. That's the only way he could possibly be less reliable than he is at this point. So I also made this tweet that this is about a point I mentioned earlier, that he got the name, the wrong infant. So he wrote about, he made this statement about baby F and baby M when it's actually child L. There's a second insulin case. So Lord only knows what the mistakes and inaccuracies he's made through just sloppiness and the fact that he's just not that good. He just isn't very good at what he does. I mean, I think that's quite clear. So then he goes on, speaking of, not people saying that he's not very good at what he does, here's his next claim in this documentary. I've had to put with an awful lot of social media abuse. That should not happen. And it certainly shouldn't happen to somebody who's played a part in convicting one of England's worst female serial killers. So this is a comment on Liz Hull on that topic. I'm sure the others have seen the way that Dr. Evans has been treated online and the way his opinions have been ridiculed and have looked at that and thought, I don't want to speak publicly for that reason. So I've dealt with this previously in the last video I made. The first thing is, it's not normal for expert witnesses to speak out in this way anyway. So the fact the others are not speaking should be considered normal. That's the first thing. Secondly, it just isn't true that Dr. Evans has received social media abuse. I've gone over this in the previous video. He doesn't have social media accounts, so no one is directly abusing him. People have said things online that are critical. You have to accept criticism if you have a public profile. That's just the way it is. And if you can't do that, then don't have a public profile. When you've done something as serious as this, and you've done such appalling things and made such appalling mistakes as Dr. Evans has made, of course people are going to be critical. And a lot of the people who are criticising him are more qualified than him. That is not abuse. Criticism is not abuse. The reason it may seem like abuse is because it's blanket criticism, because by now everyone that's examined this case knows that he's an idiot. So of course he's received a lot of criticism. He has not been abused, absolutely not. And a more likely explanation for why the others haven't come out is because they know that this is very, very serious, and they can see him make an absolute idiot of himself and making all these ridiculous comments and contradicting himself and frankly lying at times. And they don't want a part of it. Who can blame them? So then the next thing he says is, these people seem to be making things up. And I think that's because this case did not involve the Metropolitan elite. The barristers were from Liverpool. The court case was in Manchester. The expert witnesses were from West Wales and the Channel Islands. I think they can't cope with that. So I've already dealt with this ridiculous assertion earlier in this video. So unlike Dr. Evans, I won't repeat myself. I will simply say that this shows what a chip he has on his shoulder and how fixated he is with this unsupported notion. Personally, I've never... The idea that people look down on Liverpool and Manchester, two of the principal cities in Britain, is just so absurd, it doesn't even merit any consideration whatsoever. So then he goes on to say, I think they've been blindsided. I mean, what do these clever people think led to the death of these babies? They're blind to evidence. They're blind to objectivity. And she will be in the news for decades to come, and it will sell newspapers and it will create headlines, and it ever was this. So the expression is, it was ever thus. So the first thing to say about this is the most obvious source of criticism of what you did in the court case were people that are more qualified than you who've just submitted thousands of pages of reports. So you say they're blind to evidence, but you don't have any evidence at all to support your view. That some of the things that you put into the court case, there is no evidential basis for what you said. You literally fabricated stuff all of the way through the trial. That's before we even go into the Lee and Tanswell stuff. You're relying on the head of this panel for your key diagnosis. And it's not merely that the rashes are wrong. Professor Lee states very clearly in this documentary that what you are trying to cite in the court case is not what his paper describes. You can't get any worse than that. It's pointless for you to sit there and claim that you disagree. You were just plain wrong. So then he says, and that's the way it is. So let's just ignore all of that. The idea that I changed my mind was absolutely astonishing. I amended my opinion in relation to one case. I wrote to Cheshire Police, and what I amended in my report was the evidence I heard from nurses and doctors looking after him. So that contradicts what he's now written in this letter. It's extraordinary. It's incredible. We're seeing something that will, as I've said, I said this at the end of the last video, this will go down in British history for centuries. Not even decades, because the Birmingham 6 we know has gone down for decades and we're still talking about it, and that will go on for a long time to come, generations to come. The Lucy Letby case is more extraordinary than the Birmingham 6. It truly is incredible what has occurred here. And this will be spoken about long after we're all gone, long after we're all under the soil rotting. I have absolutely no doubt. So this gentleman previously denied changing his mind. This is despite the fact that he'd already admitted to The Guardian that he had changed his mind. Then in the BBC documentary, he said, well, I did change my mind, but it doesn't matter. Now he's saying that in this Channel 4 documentary, here you can see during the Channel 4 documentary, picking some daffodils. Now he's saying he hasn't changed his opinion in this documentary, and then he's written to the police, he's written to various journalists about saying, the police should review things because I did this instead, even though he's never mentioned that previously. Extraordinary. It's truly extraordinary. Who knows when this documentary was filmed and where it fits in with the evolving timeline of his claims. But what we're seeing here is absolutely incredible. I wouldn't have believed it possible 2 years ago if you had told me this had actually happened in any court case. But in a court case of this importance, where there are such brutal consequences for the defendant, I would have said that's not possible, that can't happen. Expert witnesses would obviously be a lot more professional than that. They'd obviously have their shit together. This just wouldn't happen. I guess if you'd put it in a book, it would seem too far-fetched. But it's actually happening. Let's just remind ourselves of what he says. The idea that I changed my mind was absolutely astonishing. I amended my opinion in relation to one case. So another thing to note here is he said, I didn't change my mind, I amended my opinion. So what do you think the number one synonym is for amend? It's change. So that amend and change mean the same thing. So I deny that I changed my mind. What I actually did was amend my opinion. It's the same thing, mate. Amend and change is literally the same thing. And you also didn't do that for one child. You changed it for 3 infants in the case. Furthermore, in the BBC documentary, you claimed that you decided it was inflicted harm and that it doesn't matter what form of inflicted harm it is, despite the fact that the method you changed from and the method you changed to have completely different clinical presentations. But you said, well, I've just decided it's inflicted harm, so it doesn't matter what method I put into the court case. Those are literally your words. So there are 2 possibilities, Dr. Evans. Either you genuinely believe what you're saying, in which case, even as a long since retired clinician, you're completely incompetent, or you're lying. It's as simple as that. Those are the only 2 possibilities. I don't know which one it is. I don't know to what extent you're incompetent and to what extent you're lying. It could be 100% incompetence and 0% lying, or any number of percentages between those 2. You're the only person that can answer this, and as you're incapable of giving an honest account when you're interviewed, it's going to be very difficult to find out. We may never know, but those are the only 2 options. So then he says, as a result of this, it was clear that he was a well, stable baby. Whatever the X-ray 36 hours earlier had shown could not have caused his death. What caused his death was something that had occurred just before midnight the following day in Lucy Letby's presence. So I'm not going to go over this in any great depth as it's drivel, but let me just point out that this wasn't your opinion when the trial began. Let's just make that clear. This also underlines that there is a statistical inference at the heart of this case that you keep denying. So then he says, I did not choose my view after the trial. I amended my report when giving evidence in the trial. So let's just count the problems with this. 1. Changing your view during the trial isn't any better. 2. As we've already seen, you wrote numerous reports after you definitely knew the name of Lucy Letby, and here Lucy Letby was in the courtroom staring back at you. You always make this claim, I never knew the name of Lucy Letby, I never knew anything. But in actual fact, you've written numerous reports when you did know the name of Lucy Letby, and on this occasion, you could literally see Lucy Letby when you were making this decision. 3. We know for a fact that you submitted the reports after the trial was over. Here you're claiming, oh, I only changed my mind during the trial, I didn't change my mind after the trial, as if that's better. It's not better. 4. Even taking this into consideration, there is still a disparity between what you went into court believing and expecting to deliver and what you said during the court case and what you have said since the court case and reported since the court case. And now 5, there's even further disparity about what is in this letter and what you said previously. Frankly, Dr. Evans, if you think that this doesn't matter, then you're a bigger idiot than I thought you were already, and I thought you were a monumental idiot. So then he goes on to say, the more we're looking for new evidence, the stronger the case for the prosecution. And looking at the way Lucy Letby behaved, she seemed to be animated by the fact that her baby has died. She'd say, guess what happened? Her baby died last night. She wanted to be there, wanting to organise the parents' grief. That is most weird behaviour. We are dealing with an individual who is sociopathic. So, firstly, the first thing to say is that's absolute bollocks. It's incredible that you're leaning on this incredibly weak aspect of the prosecution instead of defending your work. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is you're not qualified to make any such assertion. Anyone can agree with that. You keep making these kind of psychological statements. You said something in the ABC documentary. I forget exactly what ridiculous assertion you made in that, but it was something to do with psychology. And then the third thing is you always claim that, oh, the court case is just objective science, but in fact, you're completely obsessed with Lucy Letby. That's absolutely clear. So then he goes on to say, I'm telling you this at some stage that most of the babies who died from an injection of air into the bloodstream. So this is, I'm not going to depict this in this video, but if you watch the actual documentary, you see he gets out a syringe and inserts red wine into it and does this frankly embarrassing demonstration. So he's saying here it's something that's very easy to do. Right, this is a standard setup in any children's ward or neonatal unit. I'm using red wine simply to make it easy to see. Nobody's looking. Just connect it freshly through. You can see how the fluid's gone in the pink stuff. Then there's a bubble of air and that'll end up in the baby's circulation within seconds. Now, I don't think I really have the will at this point to deal with this in the depth that it should be dealt with. I think anyone can see that it's utterly embarrassing to do this. I don't even really need to know where to begin when it comes to responding to this, but I'll try. I'm not going to go over all of the obvious problems with using red wine as opposed to air. I'll just assume that people can intrinsically understand those. As this is completely laughable and will be treated as laughable by any healthcare professional or indeed anyone that has the sense they were born with. So I'm not going to say too much about this, but I will just briefly say this pathetic stunt only serves to indicate how easily air could be accidentally introduced to the vascular system if the line of air is not bled correctly before you give an injection of fluid into it. What he's inadvertently demonstrating here is how you cannot possibly say that air can only get into the baby's vasculature by way of intended harm. We already know that anyway from the court case. We already know that for a fact from all the scientific papers he cited, which are all about the accidental introduction of air. We already know that because every healthcare professional and every nurse will tell you that this is the case. We already know this because Michelle Warden gave a thorough explanation of this with regard to the Whoosh test when I interviewed her. So then he goes on. There was also this peculiar discoloration described by a number of doctors and nurses when these babies collapsed, and I found a number of published papers where air embolism was cause of death and where this peculiar discoloration was found. Okay, so let's go over a few points here. Firstly, he claims to have found a number of published papers. We know for a fact, undeniable fact, I've been over this so many times already, I'm not going to do it again here, he only used one paper to diagnose this. It was Lee and Tanswell. All of the other papers that he found were just case studies. They were case studies of accidental air embolism. He only used one diagnostic paper and he completely misused it, and it's not even about this topic that he used in the court case. Everyone knows that. That's the first thing. The second thing is he's got the discoloration completely incorrect. We know that now. We know that for a fact. Thirdly, he describes this as peculiar. It's not peculiar. Literally every healthcare professional I've spoken to has said that discoloration can be quite common in these circumstances. And plus, it's not the same from one infant to another. It's different discoloration that is observable in the court case. Another doctor told me that the mottling, which Dr. Evans cited, will occur in any patient that is undergoing a circulatory collapse. Dr. Jane Horden indeed expressed a surprise that mottling was cited as being significant. So then Dr. Philip Hammond goes on to discuss something that we've been through many times on this channel. Air embolism was diagnosed by Dewi Evans on the basis of exclusion, that he couldn't think of anything else that could have caused these sudden collapses. He said, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, therefore it must be air embolism. I can't think of anything else it is. It's an interesting diagnosis to make to disprove. I don't think Dewi Evans will ever admit he's made a mistake. I think he's stuck in that mindset. So I've mentioned numerous times that the diagnosis of exclusion is a complete joke because he based it on just two things: sudden collapse, failed to respond to resuscitation. It's absolutely ridiculous. He hadn't even come close to ruling out all the conditions that it could have been. It's utterly ridiculous. And then Dr. Evans goes on to say the following. I didn't watch the press conference. I've reviewed all the reports in detail. The reports I've seen are some of the weakest reports I've ever seen. They're hopeless. These people were recruited by Dr. Lee, so they were selected. And if they had been recruited, even subconsciously, if Dr. Lee had said they are misusing my evidence, then I think that would immediately prejudice their thinking process. Of course, Dr. Evans is the only person who can be truly objective. Wouldn't you say that all of his media appearances and the way he behaved in court and everything he said in this documentary, wouldn't you say that that all fits very neatly with someone you would describe as objective? To suggest that you get medics of this calibre and they've invested an enormous amount of time looking at an incredible number of documents and they're putting their personal reputations on the line for no remuneration, they've got extremely credentialed careers. We've mentioned countless times it far outweighs anyone in the court case, and it definitely far outweighs Dr. Evans. Somehow they're going to put all of that on the line for no return, and they're not going to be objective. When they're used to doing objective science, that's indeed how they've managed to become some of the most credentialed people in the world in their fields. But you're saying they're biased because they got an email from Professor Lee. But you, Dr. Evans, you, who we've seen in this documentary, who we've seen in countless other media appearances, you claim to be objective, even though you did a 7-hour drive to Chester, you're getting paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to do this, your performance since the court case has been, I think it would be generous to describe it as bizarre, but yet you're completely objective, and this panel, this enormous panel of incredible world-class experts, they're not objective. Is that what you're saying? Have you read your own reports? I must ask you. You claim that these are some of the weakest reports that you've ever seen. Have you actually read your own reports? Then we come to a thing that we assessed in depth in the last video about the panel being Americans and Canadians. So I'm going to go over this briefly. I'll just read this statement out first. On top of that, of course, they're Americans, they're Canadians. They don't know how the system works here. Americans, unfairly enough, have a reputation for functioning as hired guns, and I've experienced this a couple of times where the other side will seek an opinion from across the Atlantic because they can't get an honest opinion from the UK. No, there's no doubt about it. Well, one thing I will say is he got the right C there, so that was a good effort. He uses this strange expression about unfairly enough. So I'll get onto that in a second, but in this previous video that I made, I just demonstrated that there are only 5 people that you can legitimately say North American. There are 15 people from the panel that we know of that are not North American, so immediately that invalidates this whole statement. But then he also made this strange comment about unfairly enough, which kind of suggests that reputation is unfair. But anyway, I don't know why he said that. Maybe it was a slip of the tongue. Then he makes this comment about hired guns. Now, typically, when someone is hired, they receive money. That's usually what we mean by the term hiring someone. So is it really fair to describe them as hired guns when they're not being paid for what they're doing? Obviously, that's a rather insulting thing to say anyway, even if they were being paid. But as they're not actually being paid, to describe them as hired guns seems pretty inaccurate to me. Also, the specific reasons why Shuley and Mark MacDonald have, as you put it, recruited people from overseas has been explained. It's because it's difficult to get British experts, or they still did get one of the great, probably literally the best expert they could have possibly got from Britain. The next thing he's saying here is that only people from the UK can give an honest opinion. Now, I've kind of assessed this in the previous video, but what about the Metropolitan elite, Dr. Evans? I thought the Metropolitan elite couldn't be trusted. The way things are going, you'd only be able to get an honest medical opinion from Carmarthen. You know, I can see the NHS grinding to a halt at this rate. So you can't get an honest medical opinion for overseas. You can't get an honest medical opinion from the Metropolitan elite. Where can you get an honest medical opinion from? Also, Shuley is Canadian. Why did you use his paper centrally in the case? I presume Canadian people can be trusted to do academic papers, they just can't be trusted to do legal work. Is that the case? So then he goes on to say, I don't want to be rude about people. Most of the time they've just got their thoughts wrong. I could not believe what I read. They've got their thoughts wrong. So, he really isn't very good with language, of course, but the notion that he says, of course I don't want to be rude, I mean, that's very decent of you. I mean, you've just accused the panel of being idiots because they come from the wrong country. You've accused them of being hired guns when they haven't received any money. And you said that they're fundamentally dishonest, all with absolutely zero evidence. But hey, I don't want to be rude. You know, I'd hate to be rude. That'd be the last thing I'd want to do. So then, finally, we have this fairly extraordinary section in which the filmmaker Daniel Bogado showed Dewi Evans footage of the press conference. And he confirmed that he was watching this for the first time. I've discussed this in my previous video, and I consider it fairly extraordinary that he hadn't bothered to watch the press conference previously, considering that it's over a dozen people at that time. It's now 26 and more. There's more people on the panel that haven't been announced yet. It's a lot of professionals, extremely high-ranking professionals. Any one of them, as we've discussed previously, for example, Professor Nina Modi, massively outranks Dr. Evans. They're talking solely and entirely about the work of Dr. Evans for 2 hours, and yet he's not even bothered to watch it. That in itself just shows a complete lack of professional competence. You have to listen. If someone serious is speaking, you have to listen. Even if it's just someone at your level. If it's someone way above your level, of course you should listen to them, particularly in the medical field. So before this begins, as you can see on the screen now, we see Dr. Evans sitting up straight, sitting up confidently, waiting, speaking with the filmmaker. He's still talking crap, of course, but he was sitting up confidently. And so it moves on and we see him sitting in his armchair. So if you can see the screen, you can see the difference in posture immediately. He's sinking into his chair. We see him almost disappearing into his armchair during this sentence, almost shrinking before our eyes as this video is played before him. But immediately his body language was less confident. He slumped to the side, looking slightly less comfortable. And as it goes on, it becomes less and less comfortable. You're seeing him shrinking, disappearing into the chair. In this particular image, you can see Evans attempting the patented Moritz head tilt, but he's using it in the wrong context. You're really supposed to use it in a smug and patronising way, as Judith is demonstrating here. So I imagine when Judith hears about it, she'll be putting in a copyright claim. We then saw that there was this kind of juxtaposition between, there was a bustling scene of very important people in London, a lot of journalists, all these panel experts speaking at this meeting, and that was juxtaposed between that very, very important meeting and Dr. Evans on his own at his home in Carmarthen. And there was some very skillful filmmaking here. You notice that the directors just separate the camera from the subject, whether he's panned out or whether he's literally standing physically further back, or a bit of both, I don't know. I'm not an expert in cinematography, but we saw some scenes of Dr. Evans looking very vulnerable, very isolated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that more later on. But during this fairly extraordinary sequence, the filmmaker Daniel Bogado showed Dr. Evans footage of Professor Shuley putting 3 questions to him. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. But during this fairly extraordinary sequence, Bogado showed Evans this footage. In the film, the 3 questions were communicated via the recording of Professor Shuley speaking in London, and then Dr. Evans answered all three. But what we're going to do in this video is actually look at the questions individually and then look at the answer given. Before we do that, the first thing that Evans says in response to this is, yeah, I mean, he's wrong on all three counts. So he's not wrong, Dr. Evans. He's asking you questions. So you can't be wrong when you're asking questions. There are assertions implied by those questions, but he simply asked you three questions. So immediately, Dr. Evans, there's no interest in participating in a transparent medical process here. There's no interest in sort of addressing experts and addressing the concerns of experts and the questions of experts. He's just immediately, I want to prove that I'm right and I want to prove that the panel is wrong. That's not surprising considering what we know about him by now. So the first section, we hear Professor Shuley going, first of all, the first question would be, if our panel found so many problems with the medical care provided by this team at the hospital, how is it that Dr. Evans found none? Because in none of the 17 cases did he even identify one problem with the medical care provided at that hospital. So Dr. Evans in response to that said, first of all, he says, I've not made a single criticism of the management of the babies. This is actually wrong. I made it very clear that there was a delay in giving antibiotics in the case of baby D. So he didn't say anything else. That was it. He went on to the next question. So he couldn't give an example of any other area in which he identified a problem with the medical care, despite the enormous list and all the things we've gone over previously. There's 25 general areas cited by the expert panel, and then they're all broken down into subsections. So there's potentially hundreds of medical errors and mistakes in care with these infants. Dr. Evans mentions a delay in antibiotics in the case of child D, which was serious. But he claims that he made this very clear. So let's look at the court case. So I'm not going to read the times out, I'll just read out what was said. Court now hearing from Dr. Dewi Evans, a paediatric expert instructed by the prosecution. Nicholas Johnson Casey is asking him what he says about his review of the medical notes relating to child D. Asked about mottling we now know you'll see in any circulatory collapse, seen on child D's body the first time she collapsed, Dr. Evans says, it's very significant and extraordinarily unusual. This is not something that happens out of the blue. Asked about D's condition immediately before her collapse, Dr. Evans says, her condition could not have been better. Her condition was entirely consistent with the baby recovering from early onset pneumonia. She was doing exceptionally well and was clinically very satisfactory. But Dr. Evans says D was recovering from early onset pneumonia, not that she recovered from it. Dr. Evans asked what would have happened if pneumonia caused D's deaths. You find increased amounts of clinical input would not lead to improvement. In D's case, none of this happened. She got better. Dr. Evans says his conclusion in child D's case is that death was caused by an injection of air into her bloodstream. Ben Myers Casey, defending, asked Dr. Evans why he thinks this. Dr. Evans gives 5 reasons. D's collapse was rapid and striking, presence of discoloration, attempts to resuscitate D were unsuccessful, presence at post-mortem of air in blood vessels, none of the other issues were relevant. Let me repeat that for you. None of the other issues were relevant. What we have in D's case is a full house of clinical characteristics consistent with her having suffered an air embolism, i.e. air has been injected into her. Dr. Evans agrees with the defence that D was in a state of very poor health when she went to the neonatal unit, so downplaying mistakes on the unit. Mr. Myers refers to Dr. Evans saying D was recovering from pneumonia and suggests that she still had the potential to become quite unwell. Dr. Evans says she was in a neonatal unit, the best place on the planet for her, again downplaying medical errors on the unit. When asked by Mr. Myers again about her potential to become unwell, Dr. Evans says the potential is there, which is why she was on a neonatal unit, again downplaying errors on the unit. Mr. Myers suggests Dr. Evans doesn't want to accept problems with D's respiration because that would undermine his conclusion that D died from an air embolus. Dr. Evans says no, again downplaying poor care on the unit. And then I'll just go over Dr. Bohin briefly. So she's there to review Dr. Evans. She says Dr. Bowen said she was very clear child D had pneumonia but was on antibiotics and improving. So she is saying this child was on antibiotics and was improving because of that. So I won't read out the whole thing. So in the court reporting, there is no indication that Dr. Evans even referenced antibiotics. And then Dr. Bohin, who was singing from the same hymn sheet, all the way through the court case, states that the antibiotics were significant and that they were leading to an improvement in child D. Now, bear in mind, that is the only example that Dr. Evans could give of him citing poor practice on the unit. Just one thing, not giving antibiotics. And it appears that he never even referenced that in court. And we know for a fact from this court record that he very, very much downplayed poor treatment on the unit. So that's the first question he answered. So I'll just mention again, these are the kind of things that he could have mentioned, these 25 areas, and these were the things that were conspicuous by their absence from the court case. Also mentioned that when I interviewed Professor Colin Morley, Dr. Evans said that excellent efforts were made to resuscitate the infants, whereas Professor Colin Morley essentially dismissed this. Of course, he's far more experienced and qualified than Dr. Evans. So a second question from Professor Lee was regarding the fact that Dr. Evans was rather selective in his use of information. So if he wasn't selective, if all the information was used, in fact, he would come to a very different conclusion than what he came to. So in response to this, Dr. Evans said, I stressed to Cheshire Police that I wanted to see and did see the case notes of all the babies who died. I reviewed all of them, so again, he's factually wrong. So there, in both, I don't want to break the suspense for the third question, but in both the second and third question, Dr. Evans doesn't even answer the question. So the question he's asked there, the question he's actually answered there, is the question, did you see all of the case notes? No one disputes that he saw all the case notes. Professor Lee's asking why you didn't use the information from the case notes. You can have all of the case notes and exclude 99% of the information quite easily. The fact that you had all of the case notes is not in dispute. Professor Lee is asking you why you didn't use all of the case notes, which you haven't given any answer to. The third question was, I would ask, even when there's an obvious cause of death, why did he go around looking for malfeasance? So in response to this, Dr. Evans says, and then he says, why am I looking at malfeasance and ignoring everything else? Well, since then, we found suspected that there are additional babies murdered by Lucy Letby. So he hasn't denied that he was looking for malfeasance. He hasn't given any evidence to indicate that he wasn't looking for malfeasance. He's just said, oh, yeah, now there's a suspect that Lucy Letby's murdered more babies, supposedly, although we know that's total crap, or tried to. Well, we know it's absolute crap, of course. Because the stupid tube extubation cases just have absolutely no merit whatsoever. I think anyone can see that this is an utterly stupid answer and doesn't address the question at all. But the fact that he's asking the question, why did Dr. Evans go around looking for malfeasance? And his answer to that is, oh, there's additional babies murdered by Lucy Letby, even though she hasn't even been charged on these infants yet. To come back at that with such a response is embarrassing, frankly. All that, in fact, demonstrates is that Dr. Evans is fixated on malfeasance and fixated on Lucy Letby. It actually proves the point that Professor Lee is making in asking the question. It doesn't detract from the question at all, let alone does it address why he did such a shoddy job in looking at the cases. So then Dr. Evans goes on to say, yeah, I mean, he's wrong on all three counts. I mean, first of all, he says, I've not made a single criticism of the management of the babies. This is actually wrong. I made it very clear that there was delay in giving antibiotics in the case of baby D. So you'd hope he could have thought of something else by now, but he didn't. As for being selective, once again, he's completely wrong, utterly incorrect. And then he says, why am I looking at malfeasance and ignoring everything else? Well, since then, we've suspected that there are additional babies murdered by Lucy Letby. So Dr. Lee is wrong on all three of the observations he's made about me. I think it's very worrying, actually. I mean, it's very worrying that people are getting their facts wrong. And I think Lee had been subconsciously programmed by the poor Letby crowd. There we are. I'm glad you showed me that clip because it just shows that Lee is not up to speed with his facts. Yeah, he got his facts wrong. Never get your facts wrong. Never get your facts wrong. So I'm not going to point out all the irony here. I'll just briefly point out that he has stated that Dr. Lee, Professor Shu Lee, has been subconsciously programmed by what he describes as the poor Letby crowd. So just let that sink in if you're watching this. If you're siding with the guilty verdict, and you believe that Lucy Letby is guilty, bear in mind you're siding with someone who believes everyone in America and Canada is an idiot, and that Professor Shu Lee has been subconsciously programmed, and Lord only knows what the ridiculous claims he's made. I don't think I can go through all of them. I'd like to do a summary where I went through all the ridiculous claims, but I just think it would go on forever. So the final thing that he says is 2 of my 4 grandchildren were born at the same time that Lucy Letby was wreaking carnage in Chester Hospital. The children murdered by her should now be at school, enjoying holidays, enjoying life. That will never happen. Clearly Lucy Letby should confess, but I don't think she will. I think she's blacked off all of her crimes in order to be able to live with herself. So it's appropriate that the last thing he says is something that's completely unfounded speculation and an appeal to emotion, because that's one of his typical manipulations that he's repeated all the way through every single appearance and every single media interview that he's given. The performance by Dr. Dewi Evans in this recent Channel 4 documentary was truly extraordinary. There were several individual comments made by him that were astounding. They wouldn't be considered appropriate, let alone professional, for almost anyone in any field. It is stultifying that he thought it would be appropriate to go on camera and say these things. Furthermore, I personally find it incredible that he hasn't watched the panel interview, but was willing to go on camera and watch the panel speak, and then give his reaction in real time, completely unprepared. Truly extraordinary. Every time that I think this man can't sink any lower, can't make himself appear any more unreliable, he manages to outdo himself. It says everything about the credibility of the criminal justice system at this point in time that Dr. Evans has been entrusted with such a position of importance in a trial in case of this magnitude. It also says a lot that he has been successful in terms of carving out a career as an expert witness. This was about the only thing he said in the documentary that is actually true. Since the documentary was aired, he has written a thoroughly inept letter which has been distributed seemingly to various editors of newspapers. This is only doing himself even more damage, so why he has decided to do this, one can only speculate. By the end of this film, he looked like a rather sad, pathetic, isolated figure, and such is the degree of empathy that I have, I did feel sorry for him. This sympathy rapidly disappeared when he wrote this letter and it appeared on the internet, and I just tweeted last night to point out one of the mistakes regarding child M. So he must have tried as hard as he possibly could with that letter, and yet it still contains a really basic error. I can see a lot more problems with it very, very quickly. It's not exactly difficult. I may go over that letter at some point in the future, but I certainly felt annoyed to see that because while I think it's helpful for the defence, it just shows a complete lack of contrition for his role in this horrible situation. In response to this letter, Dr. Svelena Dimitrova tweeted her concerns for Dr. Evans' well-being and discussed the possibility that he could be suffering with dementia. Now, it's important for me to take this seriously because I'm fully aware that Dr. Dimitrova's opinion carries 10 times the weight of my opinion, and I think it's really important to acknowledge this, and I think it's important at all times for us to remain compassionate and not become like the thing that we despise. It's important to note that in this letter, Dr. Evans has made some extraordinary statements about Cheshire Police and the prosecution, which will not make the Cheshire Constabulary very happy. And one of the points that Svelena was making in their tweet was that, yes, Dr. Evans has absolutely, undeniably, very clearly been in the wrong in this case and continues to be in the wrong, but don't make it all about him. Don't let the other organisations that are complicit off the hook. So I want to emphasise firstly that I have stated, and I still hold this opinion, that Dr. Evans is primarily responsible for this situation. The reason I say that is if Svelena or any other competent neonatologist or paediatrician had walked into the police station, we wouldn't be sitting here now. This case would never have gone forward. It would be over and Lucy would have been fine. While I hold Dr. Evans primarily responsible, I also want to emphasise that this is indeed about an extraordinary series of systemic failings. There are failings at the hospital, there are failings among the consultants, there are failings with the police, there are failings with the Crown Prosecution Service, there are failings with the judge, and there are failings with the criminal justice system as a whole. I will never let any of those organisations, groups or entities off the hook, rest assured. While I take Dr. Dimitrova's words very seriously, I probably should say I met her briefly at this point, but I only spoke to her for a few minutes. I'd love to have spoken to her for hours, but I had a train to catch. But I'll also say that I spoke at length with someone who worked at the same hospital as Dr. Evans, and based on what he told me, it wouldn't be at all surprising to me if what we're seeing with Dr. Evans is simply the pattern of behaviour that he has exhibited throughout his entire life, and that he's absolutely compos mentis. This is just the way he is, and this is just the way that he behaves. In response to his letter, Tried by Stats has posted last night that what Dr. Evans has written should be a real wake-up call for journalists. The Crown's star witness is brazenly lying here, throwing the prosecution under the bus because of his mistake. The transcripts and all the pre-trial reports show he's lying. It's a provable lie. Journalists really need to hold him to account. It's so unbelievably bleak if he's able to just walk away from this, follow up on his request, and ask the prosecution to set the story straight. And then we also had this tweet from Peter Elston indicating that in his email correspondence with Dr. Evans there were a string of lies, which I don't doubt for 1 second. We know this is a miscarriage of justice. Every serious and credible person is on our side. There are no serious and credible people on the other side. And then it's built on the foundation of this gentleman, Dr. Evans, who couldn't conceivably be less reliable or credible if he tried. It's almost pointless for me to sum up his abject performance in this film and the sheer stupidity of it. It speaks for itself. It reminds me of a joke by the comedian Dennis Pennis. He was approaching a particular celebrity, I think it was Tony Curtis, and he said something along the lines of, "I specialise in making people look ridiculous, but on this occasion I don't think I'll bother saying anything." That's where we are with Dr. Evans. He's an absolute figure of fun and ridicule at this point. It would be comical if it wasn't so serious. On Tuesday, the 2nd of May 2023, Ben Myers, Lucy Letby's defence barrister, spoke with her in court. Mr. Myers asked Letby about her being arrested for the first time. Letby says this was like nothing she had ever experienced before. Wiping away tears, Letby said there was a knocking on the door at 6 a.m. from police at a Westbourne Road, Chester home. At the time, her father was with her. They had no idea at all the police were coming that day. They told me I was being arrested for multiple counts of murder. They put me into handcuffs and took me away. After 3 days of police interviews, Letby was released on bail. She says she was not allowed to return to her Chester home and went to live with her parents in Hereford. Becoming tearful, she says the second arrest in 2019 was a mirror image of the first arrest. It was the most scary thing I've ever been through. It just traumatised me. When I see even an iota of contrition from Dr. Dewi Evans for what he has done, I might consider taking it a little bit easier on him. Until then, I don't care how old, how frail, how sorry for yourself you might feel, Dewi, this is only just beginning for you. If you've enjoyed this video and found it informative, it would be very much appreciated if you could subscribe to the channel. Obviously, I also appreciate likes and comments. I tried to respond to as many comments as possible. I received an enormous amount of comments for the last video, so that's very much appreciated. I tried to respond to as many as I could. It got slightly out of control for me as I had to record this video, so I did miss a few, but I think I did 90% perhaps. I tried. But yeah, I love receiving comments. So many useful observations. I always learn something, so if you have any comments to make, please leave it. And of course, it's appreciated if you subscribe to the channel. It helps me and it helps the channel. So if you could do that, then I would really appreciate that. The last thing I'm going to say is that on Saturday, Liz, I was in court every day. Hull, it's your turn.